Same plant, same seed packet, two different homes, a plastic container on a patio, or a raised bed dug into the backyard. Everyone growing tomatoes eventually asks the same question: which one actually produces more fruit? Most videos on this topic pick a side and never show their work. They'll show you one beautiful harvest photo and call it proof, without ever mentioning the variety, the pot size, or the region it was grown in. We're not doing that today. We're going to walk through what university extension research, raised bed guides, and container growing data actually say. Put the real numbers side by side and let you decide which setup fits your space, with no assumption that bigger claims mean better information, and no pretending a single anecdote settles the question. Let's start with the baseline, because before we compare containers and raised beds, we need to know what a healthy tomato plant produces in general, regardless of setup. According to extension programs at the University of Maryland, the University of California, and West Virginia University, a properly cared for tomato plant typically yields 10 to 15 pounds of fruit or more over a season. That's the number most home gardeners should treat as a realistic starting benchmark, regardless of where the plant is rooted. Some sources describe a slightly wider range depending on support method. A plant left to sprawl on the ground without staking might land closer to 8 to 15 pounds, while a properly staked, trellised, or caged plant tends to sit at the higher end of that range or above it, simply because better support means better light exposure and fewer fruit lost to rot on damp soil. Anything dramatically above that in a single plant claim online, 50, 60, 80 pounds from one plant, is usually describing an exceptional, well-documented outlier under ideal conditions, not a typical result you should plan your season around. Now let's look at raised beds specifically, because this is where growing method starts to matter. Raised bed guidance breaks the picture into two tomato types, and the difference is significant. Determinate varieties, compact plants like Roma or Bush Early Girl that grow to a set size and then stop, tend to produce a concentrated harvest, generally in that 10 to 15 pound range per plant, all arriving over a relatively short window, which is actually convenient if you're planning to can or preserve a batch all at once. Indeterminate varieties, vining types like beefsteak or brandywine that keep growing and fruiting until frost, can produce considerably more, commonly cited around 20 to 30 pounds per plant over a full season, because they simply have more time and more plant to work with, continuously setting new flowers and fruit clusters as the season goes on rather than stopping after one flush. In an 8-plant raised bed, that gap compounds fast, roughly 80 to 120 pounds total with determinate varieties, versus a possible 160 to 240 pounds with indeterminate ones under good conditions. The reason raised beds support this range so well comes down to root space and soil control. You're giving the plant a full, deep volume of soil you've built and amended yourself with drainage you control directly. And a raised bed typically warms up faster in spring too, which can stretch the effective growing season a little longer on both ends. A collection of various plastic and ceramic pots on a bright, sunny patio. University extension guidance from West Virginia and New Hampshire recommends one tomato plant per 4 or 5 gallon container as a general minimum, using an artificial potting mix rather than regular garden soil because containers have no access to the deep soil reservoir of water and nutrients that a raised bed or in-ground plant can draw on. That single fact drives almost everything else about container tomatoes. Smaller containers physically cap how large a root system can grow, and a smaller root system means the plant simply cannot support as much fruiting mass. No amount of fertilizer fully compensates for a root ball that's run out of room to expand into. This is why container growing guides consistently push gardeners toward larger pots for anything beyond a compact variety. Indeterminate types are generally recommended to have 15 to 25 gallons of root space to perform well, while smaller 5 to 15 gallon pots are better matched to determinate or dwarf varieties that were bred to stay compact in the first place. Some growers do push container size even further, using 25-gallon fabric grow bags for full-sized indeterminate plants specifically to close that gap with raised bed performance. But that also means a container setup capable of matching a raised bed's output usually isn't small or cheap anymore. It's essentially a portable raised bed in its own right with the soil volume the fertilizer needs and often the price tag to match. There's also a maintenance difference that directly affects yield, not just convenience. Multiple sources note that containers dry out significantly faster than raised beds, sometimes requiring watering once or even twice a day in summer heat. And nutrients deplete faster too, since there's a fixed, limited volume of soil instead of an expansive bed to buffer against swings in temperature and moisture. Miss a watering cycle in a small pot during fruit development, and you're looking at classic problems like blossom end rot or fruit cracking. Issues that are far more forgiving in a raised bed's larger, more stable soil volume, where a missed day of water gets absorbed by the sheer mass of soil around the roots instead of immediately stressing the plant. In other words, container tomatoes don't just start with less potential. They're also less forgiving of small mistakes along the way, which matters a lot if this is your first season growing and you're still learning to read what your plants need. So here's the honest answer to the actual question. Which produces more? Raised beds have a real structural advantage. More consistent root space, more stable moisture, and full support for both determinate and vigorous indeterminate varieties, which is exactly why extension guidance and raised bed growers report yields spanning that wider 10 to 30 pound per plant range. Containers can absolutely produce a respectable harvest, particularly with compact or determinate varieties matched to a properly sized pot, 15 gallons or larger. But they're working with a hard ceiling that a raised bed simply doesn't have, and every source pushing container success emphasizes going bigger on pot size specifically because of that constraint. But they're working with a hard ceiling that a raised bed simply doesn't have, and every source pushing container success emphasizes going bigger on pot size specifically because of that constraint. In a container versus a raised bed, and measures the yield difference directly under identical conditions. What we have instead is extension data on raised bed yields, separate extension guidance on container plant spacing and root volume requirements, and grower experience describing the practical challenges of containers. Combining those honestly gets you a clear directional answer. Raised beds have a structural yield advantage, especially for indeterminate varieties. But it does not get you a precise number, like raised beds produce exactly 40% more. A close-up of someone's eye as they read something on a screen, looking thoughtful and cautious. And it's worth being skeptical of any channel that presents a suspiciously clean percentage without naming where it came from. Here's where this actually matters for your own setup. If you have yard space for even a modest raised bed, and you want maximum pounds of tomatoes per plant, the numbers favor the raised bed, particularly if you're interested in indeterminate vining varieties that reward extra root space and a full season of growth. This is also the better setup if you're planning to grow enough to can, freeze, or preserve a real batch, since the higher ceiling gives you more room to hit that volume. If you're working with a balcony, patio, or rented space where a raised bed isn't possible, containers are still a completely legitimate way to grow real, satisfying tomatoes. You just need to be deliberate about it instead of treating any old pot as good enough. Go with the largest pot your space and budget allow. Choose determinate or container-specific varieties bred to perform within limited root space, and treat consistent watering as non-negotiable rather than optional, since containers punish inconsistency far more than raised beds do, and a single missed hot afternoon can undo weeks of good care. A few mistakes show up again and again in both setups. The first is undersizing the container. A lot of first-time growers use a pot that's too small for the variety they've chosen. And a plant will fight for water and nutrients in a 5-gallon pot when it actually needed 20, quietly capping the harvest before the season even really gets going. Close-up of cracked hard gray garden clay soil in a pot, bad drainage visual. Or building a raised bed without enough compost and organic matter to actually support a full season of fruiting. The third is ignoring the determinate versus indeterminate distinction entirely and being surprised when a vining variety outgrows a small container, or a compact variety underperforms in a bed sized for something bigger and hungrier. And the fourth is inconsistent watering, especially in containers, where missing even a day or two during fruit development is enough to trigger blossom end rot or splitting, that a raised bed's steadier soil moisture would have buffered against without you even noticing there had been a gap. So, container tomatoes versus raised bed tomatoes, which actually produces more? Based on what's actually documented, raised beds have the structural edge, mainly because of root space and moisture stability, and that edge grows larger the more vigorous your chosen variety is. Containers can still produce a real worthwhile harvest, but they're working within a ceiling that depends heavily on pot size and variety choice, and they demand more consistency from you to get there. Neither setup is the wrong choice. They're suited to different amounts of space and different levels of hands-on attention. And now you have the actual numbers behind that choice, instead of a guess based on one impressive photo you saw online. If you want the next comparison in this series, testing raised beds against growing tomatoes directly in native ground soil and whether that old-fashioned approach still holds up against modern raised bed setups, that breakdown is coming next, with the same sourced, dated approach we just used here. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and let me know in the comments. Are you working with a container, a raised bed, or open ground this season? And which variety are you planning to grow?